Hi everyone, Susanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. Today's video is going to be a bit of a follow-on video to my last two. So I recently uploaded a video on how to pattern a princess seam bodice, and then my next video was how to pattern an A-line skirt. In this one I'm going to show how I sew up that entire pattern into this dress. So it's not a short video, it's not a quick and basic make, but hopefully it will be helpful to some of you out there that are interested in patterning stripes or matching up stripes, and there's a few different techniques in here that I've tried to keep the detail in. So as I say, hopefully you will find it useful. So if you're interested in seeing that, then let's get started.
So I'm using this soft canvas, which is quite a structured fabric, but I think matches the design nicely. I'm using a really lightweight cotton lawn for lining the bodice. And as for the layout, for my front and back centerpieces, I want a chevron effect. So I've just folded my fabric along a 45-degree angle and pressed it, and that gives me that nice crease you see here that I'm using to butt my pattern piece up against, and that will give me that nice stripe direction that I'm looking for. So I've just pinned that in place, taking care that I'm being really careful and the fabric remains butted up against that center line. And I'm only cutting one piece of the front here. I'm going to cut the second piece separately. So to do that, I've popped the piece that I've just cut on top of some fresh fabric, and I've made sure that the cut piece, the direction of the stripes on the cut piece, matches up perfectly with the stripe direction on the new piece underneath. Once I'm happy that everything's matched up, I've pinned it in place and then just cutting it out. And again, I'm being super careful here to make sure I'm not moving the fabric underneath too much when I'm cutting. So just snipping my notches, and there you see that nice chevron effect. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing on the back, and I've kept this in so that you guys can see it just once more. So I've pressed my fabric, I've got myself that nice crease line along the 45-degree angle. I've butted my pattern piece up against that angle and pinned it in place. Cut that out on one layer of fabric. And now I'm going to do the same thing as I did on the front again. So I've placed my cut piece on top of some fresh fabric. I'm making sure that the direction of the stripes on the cut piece matches perfectly the direction of the stripes on the new fabric underneath, pinning that in place and then cutting the whole thing out. And this will be the two sides of my back complete. So just snipping my notches, and then when I open this out you'll see the chevron effect. So happy with that. And now I have two more pattern pieces to complete my bodice. So I have this one, the side front, and also a side back. And for these two pieces I want the stripe direction to run horizontally from the front right round to the back. So I'm cutting one layer of fabric for my side front, and of course I do this twice. But then I want to make sure that the stripes match up on the side back as well. So I've just popped that cut piece on top of some fresh fabric. I'm then butting up my side back pattern piece against the cut piece to make sure that when I cut this, the direction of the stripes are all going the same way. They're all lined up, so that when I come to sew, everything will match nicely. So just cutting that piece out, and of course I do this twice as well. And because I'm lining the bodice, I'm cutting all of those pieces so you can see the four pieces of my bodice here, cutting those all out in lining fabric as well. So I have two layers of lining fabric cut for each piece. And then on the bodice front and bodice back, they're both cut as I mentioned on the bias, and I wasn't sure how to treat these, but I decided I would use a really lightweight interface and interface all of these pieces. Working on the bias is new to me, so I'll let you know how that works out once I've washed this dress a few times. So here I'm just pinning up my center front seam, and you can see me pick that top piece of fabric up every time I place a pin in. I'm checking here to make sure that my lines still match up as I pin along it. So that's that done, and I've went ahead and pinned the princess seams on either side of the front. The stripes are going in a different direction here, so I'm not too bothered about the stripe matching. I've done exactly the same thing on my lining pieces, so the center front seam and both the princess seams all pinned up. And now I can get to some sewing. So I'm starting with the center front seam, and I'm doing the same thing I did when I was pinning. So to make sure as I'm stitching across this seam, I'm lifting up the top layer of fabric to make sure that the stripes remain where I want them to be. So you'll see here in a second that everything matches up really nicely. I'm super pleased with how this turned out. And then onto that princess seam on the front. So same thing here again, I'm just taking it nice and gently the whole way along, sticking to my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end. And that's how that looks. So happy with that. And then onto the back. So I have my back and my side back pinned along that princess line. I've done exactly the same thing with the lining, and now just to stitch those up. So I'm only showing one side of each piece as I'm stitching. Just bear in mind I'm doing the same thing on the other side of the striped fabric and the same thing on the lining. So at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end, and that's my back and my side back joined. So pleased with that. And this is how I'm looking so far. So I've got my chevron in the middle, I have my princess seams on the front and the back. I've snipped some of the fabric out of the princess seam on the front and pressed all of my seams open. And then I've pinned my shoulder seams ready for stitching. I've done exactly the same thing on the lining, so pressed out my seams on the back and the center front, snipped out the curves on the princess seam and pressed, and then pinned my shoulder seams. So just stitching here at my 1 centimeter allowance, back stitching at the start and the end. And as I say, I do this for the other shoulder seam and the lining. That's that done. And now I want to join the lining to the striped fabric. So I'm going to join it initially at the neckline. So I'm just making sure that everything lines up. So shoulder seams and center front. Back stitching at the start, sticking to my 1 centimeter seam allowance, and I'm taking it relatively slowly around these curves. I want to maintain the really nice curved shape of the neckline here. So just taking my time, and this is how it looks. And now I want to make sure that everything sits underneath nicely, so I want to understitch. So in preparation for that, I've pressed my seam to the right hand side and snipped the whole way around. And then I'm stitching directly on top, about 2 millimeters away from the seam edge, using a little bit of a longer stitch, back stitching at the start and the end. And that's that done. And now I'm going to do the same thing on the sides, so on the armholes. So I'm back stitching at the start, making sure everything lines up the whole way across, sticking to my 1 centimeter seam allowance, taking it relatively slowly here as well, making sure I maintain that nice curved shape of the armhole, back stitching at the end, and that's that done. And now I've just treated this in the same way as I've treated the neckline. So I've snipped out some of the fabric from the seams on both sides of the arms, and then I've turned the whole thing in right way, given it a nice press so everything is nice and neat around the armhole and the neckline. And now I'm ready to close up the bodice. So here I want to match the stripes here, so I'm going to take it nice and easy. Take my time and make sure that the stripes do line up perfectly along that seam of the side. So pinning the whole way along, making sure the seam at the underarm matches up nicely. Just checking my stripes again, making sure they're still lined up. And then pinning the lining. And now I'm ready to stitch. So starting with the lining, back stitching at the start, sticking to my 1 centimeter seam allowance. And when I get to the stripe fabric, I'm doing the same as I've done on the center front. I'm just making sure that the stripes still remain lined up as I'm stitching across. Back stitching at the end. And this is how that looks. And I promise you they are lined up. I think it's just the camera angle. So now I'm going to leave the bodice to the side for the moment and work on the skirt. So this is my back piece and I have 2 layers of fabric underneath. Just cutting out and popping in my notches. So I have notches at the hem that will help me whenever I come to press the hem up. I have a notch at the waistline at the back which will help me when I come to place the bodice to make sure that the princess seam lines up. And then onto the front. So the only difference here from the pattern that I showed in a previous video is that I've added a placket to the front of this. So the lines you can see at the top of your screen, now more towards the right of your screen, those 3 lines are my placket. So I have 1 inch for the button, 1 inch for interfacing, and then I have a 1 centimeter seam allowance. And I'm snipping each of those lines so that when I come to press, I can make sure everything's even. And then onto the pocket. So I have 2 layers of fabric underneath. I've made sure that the horizontal lines match up on both of those layers of fabric, and I've went ahead and cut out my pocket pieces, both in lining and in the striped fabric. I've pinned those up, right sides together, and I'm going to stitch, leaving that little gap that I'm pointing out there, so at the side and at the top. So back stitching at the start, pivoting at my corner, sticking to my 1 centimeter seam allowance, leaving that gap at the side, and then stitching close the opening. And I've left that gap at the side so that I can turn the whole thing in right way out. So I'm going to use that gap now. So I've went ahead and done that. I've pressed the whole pocket and this is how it looks. And now just to place that onto the front of the skirt. So again, I'm taking my time to make sure that everything is lined up as it should be, pinning in place, and then I'm going to stitch across the top of the pocket at the waistline, down the side, and I'm stitching about 2 millimeters away from the seam of the pocket, or the edge, should I say, of the pocket, pivoting at my corner, across the bottom of the pocket, up the side seam, and back stitching at the end. And that's my pocket attached. So really pleased with that, it's nice and neat, love that. And then here's the placket I mentioned earlier. So I have my 1 centimeter seam allowance, you'll see here, so that's the first bit at the top. Then I have a 1 inch where I've placed some interfacing. I've pressed that all in underneath, and now I just want to close up the placket at the bottom. And to do that, I folded over my interface piece, over the top of the skirt, placed a pin at my hemline, and I'm just going to stitch across. So just running a few stitches across that bottom piece, back stitching at the start and the end. And now, if I turn this in the right way now, there'll be quite a lot of fabric at that bottom corner. So I just want to remove some of that fabric. So just snipping out about 1 centimeter in and about 3 centimeters up, and then snipping the seam allowance in half. So turning the placket in right way so that it's nicely in underneath. Adjusting my hem. And this is how that looks. And once it's all pressed, that will be super neat. So setting the front piece aside for now, I'm going to work on the back. So I've just pinned up my centre back seam, leaving 8 inches at the top open, and this I will use for my zip later on when I attach the bodice. So just stitching down that centre back seam at my 1 centimetre seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end, and that's that done. And now I've went ahead and finished all of the seams of my skirt. So the side seams and the centre back seam, I've just ran them through the overlocker, pinned up my side seams, and now to stitch at my 1 centimetre seam allowance the whole way down. Back stitching at the start and the end. And as I mentioned, I'm not too bothered about matching up the stripes on the side seams of the skirt. I think there's enough stripe matching going on in this dress. So this is how we look now on the skirt. So I've got my opening at the back for my zip. My pockets are on, they're all nicely top stitched. My placket's all nicely folded in underneath on both sides and pressed. And I've finished the hem of my skirt on the overlocker and pressed the whole thing up. So now just to stitch that in place. So I'm using a little bit of a longer stitch length here, back stitching at the start and the end, and you'll see that longer stitch length there. And now this placket is a false placket. It's a perfectly usable placket as it is, but because I'm putting a zip in the back, I'm just going to stitch the placket together. So I've lined up the placket underneath with the placket on top, and I'm just stitching along either edge. So that's one line done, and I'm going to run a line, just as you see me pointing out here, parallel. And that will hold everything in place, but it'll also give a really nice effect on the centre front seam. So that's that done. So pleased with that. And now I want to add buttons to this. So I've placed my first button about 1.5 inches down from the waist, and then I've measured from that 8 centimetres and placed a button at each of my 8 centimetre intervals. I'm now then replacing my button with a pin as a marker, and I'm just going to sew those buttons in place. So I went ahead and done that off camera, and I'm super pleased with how this turned out. And now I want to join up the bodice to the skirt. So I'm first of all joining up at the pocket edges and the princess seam of the bodice, popping a pin in, and then at the centre front seam of the bodice and the centre of the placket, at my side seams, and then I have a notch at the back of the skirt that matches up to the princess seam on the back. So just pinning the whole way across and stitching at my 1 centimetre seam allowance. And as I'm stitching here, I'm trying to make sure when I go over each of these seam lines that everything remains lined up as it should. And you'll see here, I think I managed to do it, so my princess seam matches up with my pocket nicely, so super pleased with that. And now on to the back. So I just want to put the closure in now, and in preparation for putting that closure in, I've pressed my seam allowances in underneath along that centre back seam. I then went ahead off camera and just tacked that in place just by hand. So that's just a temporary stitch line that I'll remove once I've sewn the zip in place. So I'm placing the zip here, I'm making sure that the teeth of the zip run right along that centre seam, and then again I've just off camera tacked that in place. And now to stitch. So I'm starting at the top of the zip, back stitching. I'm stitching about 4 or 5 mils away from the zip teeth, right the whole way down one side, pivoting, and then up the other side, and back stitching at the end. And then I've just went ahead and removed all of my tacking stitches, and this is what I get. So that's my zip in at the back, and my chevron all matches up, so I am super pleased with that. And then the very last thing I have to do is to secure my lining on the inside. So I've just pressed all my seam allowances in underneath. I'm then wrapping that seam allowance at the top around the top of the zip, just to keep that all nicely enclosed, I've pressed my waist seam allowance up towards the bodice, and I'm now just going to hand stitch the lining in place. So along the edge of the zip, I'm making sure I'm staying a good 4 or 5 millimeters away from the teeth, just so that I can pull this zip up and down easily and the lining's not going to get stuck in it. And I'm just running whip stitches the whole way around the lining and then back up the side of the zip again. So just showing here that that's the lining all in place and secure. And that is my dress complete. So I have my princess seam on the front, I've got my chevrons the whole way up the centre front, my lining's in place, it's all nicely secure around the neckline and the underarm. I've got my buttons the whole way down the centre front, my pockets which are fully lined, nicely top stitched, and then my placket which I really love, and then my top stitching along the hem. And on the back, so I've got the chevron, I've got the princess seam, and everything matches up the way I want it to, which I love. And this is how it looks on. So as I mentioned, I really love how this has turned out. I love the shape of the skirt, the pockets, I love the whole playing about with the stripes, the fit. I just really love this dress.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful and maybe helpful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you on Friday in my next one. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye folks!